Hello everyone, it's hard to find the right place to start, especially when I'm still figuring out how I ended up here, lost in my own life, carrying secrets so heavy they feel like they'll pull me under. I guess it began with the small things that seemed ordinary at first but built up over time until they became unbearable. I didn't plan on any of this, I didn't see it coming, and I sure didn't expect my life to become a secret so ugly that I can barely look at myself in the mirror. Growing up in a small town, life was simple. There wasn't much to do except work, maybe catch a movie at the little theater on Main Street if you had the time or the money. My family didn't have much of either, so right after high school I started working at the local bakery. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the routine, the smell of fresh bread in the morning, the warmth of the ovens, the steady rhythm of kneading dough. Plus, I needed the job to help support my family. My dad had been sick for a while and Mom couldn't keep everything afloat on her own. I was 19 when I met Matt. He came into the bakery one Saturday morning, dirt and sawdust still clinging to his jeans from working on some job. His smile was friendly, a little shy, and he had this easy way about him, like he wasn't in any rush to be anywhere else. At first I thought nothing of it, just another customer, but then he started coming by more often. He'd linger at the counter making small talk, asking about my day. He always ordered the same thing, a cinnamon roll and black coffee. One evening not long after he started coming by, he asked me out. We went to the diner down the street, the kind of place where the waitresses know your name and the jukebox plays the same old songs every night. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. We talked for hours about nothing and everything until the neon lights outside flickered off and the place was ready to close. Our relationship moved fast after that. There wasn't much to think about. We were young, in love, and in a small town getting married felt like the next step. So not long after we tied the knot in the same little church my parents got married in. It was a modest wedding, nothing extravagant, but it felt right. I thought I'd found my happy ending. The first few years of our marriage were good, maybe even great. Matt worked as a carpenter, following in his father's footsteps, and I kept my job at the bakery, saving what we could, dreaming of buying a little house on the edge of town. We talked about kids early on, excited at the thought of starting a family, but after a while those conversations turned into hushed prayers, each passing month bringing disappointment. We tried, we really did, but nothing happened at first. We just brushed it off, telling ourselves it wasn't the right time. But the longer we waited, the more it began to eat away at us, at me especially. I started wondering if maybe it was me, if there was something wrong with my body. I kept those thoughts to myself, though not wanting to burden Matt, but I could see the frustration building in him too, even if he didn't say it out loud. And then came the questions, the ones that started as innocent curiosity from his parents, but slowly turned into pointed comments. His father, Gary, was the kind of man who always seemed larger than life. He had this way of filling a room not with noise, but with presence. People respected him, they listened when he spoke, mostly because he didn't mince words. He wasn't unkind, but he had that old-fashioned belief that a man's worth was tied to what he could build, what he could pass on, and in Gary's eyes part of that was making sure Matt and I had kids. It started off innocent enough. At family dinners his mother would ask how we were doing, if we were thinking about little ones, yet I'd smile, say something vague, and Matt would squeeze my hand under the table. But over time questions became more pointed, more direct. When are you two going to give me some grandkids? He'd ask, leaning back in his chair, his eyes sharp. The family name doesn't carry itself, you know. Each comment landed like a blow, making me feel smaller, more inadequate. I could see it getting to Matt too. He'd shrug it off in front of his father, but later when we were alone the silence between us would stretch heavy with unspoken fears. We tried, and every time we failed it was like another crack formed in our marriage. One night, after a particularly uncomfortable dinner at Matt's parents' house, we talked about going to see a doctor. I suggested it, thinking maybe there was something simple we could do, some easy fix, but Matt didn't want to hear it. There's nothing wrong with me, he'd say, shutting down the conversation before it could even start. He wouldn't even entertain the idea that the problem could be his, that maybe we needed help, and that made things harder. The tension between us grew. We still loved each other, still shared quiet moments in bed at night, but there was a distance forming, like a rift that neither of us knew how to bridge, and Gary wasn't helping. He kept bringing it up each time with a little more force, like he thought we were just being lazy about it, like we weren't trying hard enough. I remember the night it all changed so clearly. Matt had been working late on a big project and I was home alone. Gary stopped by unexpectedly, offering to help fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen. I wasn't expecting him, but I didn't think much of it. He'd always been the type to pop in and help out while he worked. I made some small talk, more out of politeness than anything else, but once the faucet was fixed and he wiped his hands clean, he didn't leave. Instead, he lingered, his eyes on me in a way that felt different. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then he said something that made my stomach drop. You know, he began leaning against the counter. Sometimes when a couple has trouble conceiving, it's not always the man's fault. I froze, not sure where he was going with this. You ever thought maybe it's just the wrong man? His voice was soft, almost kind, but the words were anything, but it took me a moment to understand what he was implying. When it finally sank and I felt a wave of nausea, I couldn't breathe, my hands were trembling, and all I could think was, what the hell is happening? I didn't say anything, I just stared at him, hoping maybe I misunderstood, that maybe this was some sick joke, but the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered on my body, it wasn't a joke. I knew exactly what he meant. I think you should leave, I managed to say, my voice barely audible, shaking. Gary didn't argue. He didn't even apologize. He just smirked, grabbed his coat, and left, leaving me standing there in the kitchen, feeling like my world had just shifted in the worst possible way. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, the disgust that had lodged itself in my chest. I didn't tell Matt. How could I? How could I possibly explain that his father, the man he respected more than anyone, had said something so vile it would destroy him? So I buried it deep, pretending nothing had happened. But the weight of that secret began to change me. I could feel it, the way it settled like a stone inside me, growing heavier with each passing day. For a few weeks I managed to convince myself that what had happened with Gary was just a terrible isolated moment. Maybe he was drunk, or just trying to get a reaction out of me. He hadn't touched me, hadn't actually done anything, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been. That's what I kept telling myself. Maybe I was overreacting, making it more than it was. I buried the whole incident so deep I almost convinced myself it never happened. Almost. But every time we visited his parents' house after that, I could feel the shift. Gary didn't say anything to me, at least not at first, but I knew from the way his eyes followed me across the room that he hadn't forgotten, and I hadn't either. I'd catch him looking, and it would send a chill down my spine. But I didn't say anything to Matt. How could I? He idolized his father, and the cracks in our marriage were already wide enough. Adding this would shatter everything, so I stayed quiet. But quiet doesn't mean unaffected. Over time, the tension in our marriage grew, creeping into every part of our lives. Matt was still working long hours, more now than before. He was always tired, always distracted, and I was left alone more often than not, sitting in a house that felt too big, too empty, and too silent. When he came home late, he'd collapse on the couch, and we'd barely exchange a few words before he drifted off to sleep. We didn't touch each other much anymore. What little intimacy we had was distant, mechanical, like we were just going through the motions of being a married couple. I think that's what made what happened next possible. Maybe if things had been different between me and Matt, if we'd still been close, if we still had that spark, maybe I would have had the strength to push Gary away. But I didn't. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Matt was out of town working on a big carpentry project that was going to keep him away for the weekend. I was home alone, cleaning the kitchen, trying to keep myself busy, when I heard the knock on the door. When I opened it, there stood Gary, wearing that same friendly smile he always wore when he wanted something. Matt told me he'd be out all weekend, he said, stepping inside before I could even invite him, and thought I'd come by and check on you, see if you needed any help around the house. I didn't need help. I didn't want him there, but what was I supposed to say? He was family. So I nodded and let him come in, telling myself I was overreacting again, that nothing would happen. He didn't say anything inappropriate right away, just talked casually about work, about the weather, while I wiped down the counters and tried to keep a safe distance between us. But then as I was cleaning the sink, I felt him come up behind me. He was too close, his breath warm on the back of my neck. I froze, not daring to turn around, my heart pounding in my chest. You ever think about what I said last time? His voice was low, almost a whisper. I gripped the rag in my hand tighter, my knuckles white. You need to leave, Gary, I said, my voice shaking. I was trying to sound strong, but I wasn't. I was terrified, and he knew it. He didn't leave. Instead, he put his hands on my shoulders, gentle but firm, holding me in place. You don't have to be scared, he murmured. I know what you need. You and Matt, you're struggling. I can help you. I can give you what you want. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Stop, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Now, please. He did stop. His hand slid down my arms, and I felt my body go rigid with fear. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, frozen, and a part of me hated myself for not fighting harder. But I was scared, scared of him, scared of what this could do to Matt, scared of what would happen if I screamed and someone heard. This was a small town, people talked. You don't have to say anything, he whispered, his hands roaming over me. Just let me take care of it. I don't know why I didn't scream, why I didn't push him away with all the strength I had. Maybe it was because I knew deep down that no one would believe me over him. Maybe it was because I knew that if I fought back, things could get worse. Or maybe in that awful, twisted moment, I was too broken to resist. I don't remember how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. When it was over, I was left standing there, numb, my body shaking, my mind blank. Gary didn't say anything as he left, didn't apologize or even look at me. He just walked out the door like nothing had happened, leaving me there feeling hollow. That night I sat on the bathroom floor for hours, scrubbing my skin raw, trying to wash away the shame, the guilt, but it wouldn't go away no matter how hard I scrubbed. It was still there, clinging to me, weighing me down. And then there was the silence, the crushing, suffocating silence of a secret too big to bear. I didn't tell Matt. How could I? If I told him, it would destroy everything. Our marriage was already fragile, hanging by a thread. This would tear it apart. And what if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I'd invited it? Or worse, what if he believed me but couldn't bear the shame of it, of knowing that his father had done this? So I stayed silent. I buried it deep, hoping that somehow I could forget, but I couldn't. Every time I saw Gary after that, I felt sick. He acted like nothing had happened, but there was something in his eyes, something dark and knowing, and every time I was alone with him, I was terrified it would happen again. For weeks I lived in that fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, flinching every time the doorbell rang. I started avoiding family gatherings, making excuses not to go, but Matt noticed. He asked me what was wrong, if I was feeling okay, but I just smiled and told him I was fine. He believed me. Why wouldn't he? But I wasn't fine. I was crumbling piece by piece, and no one could see it, not even me. After that first time with Gary, I started living in a state of constant fear. It's strange how quickly fear becomes part of your routine, like a quiet lurking shadow that never quite leaves. I tried to keep myself busy, keeping the house spotless, over committing to the bakery, anything to avoid being alone, but there's only so much you can do to keep the darkness at bay, and eventually life finds ways to remind you just how vulnerable you are. Matt had no idea what was going on. He'd come home from work exhausted and plopped down on the couch, his mind consumed with job deadlines and the endless grind. He was barely present, and I didn't blame him. He was trying to keep everything together, working hard for us, for our future family that was still nowhere in sight. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him how scared I was, how much pressure I felt from his father, but I couldn't. Every time I tried to open my mouth, the words felt like they were trapped behind a wall of guilt. I didn't know how to explain it, didn't know if I'd even survive saying it out loud. The worst part was Gary acted as though nothing had happened in front of everyone else. He was the same charming, strong-willed man he'd always been. When we'd go to Sunday dinners at their place, he'd crack jokes, slap Matt on the back, and talk about the next big project he was working on. It was almost like he was daring me to say something, daring me to break the silence, and I couldn't. Because I wasn't ready to face the fallout. I wasn't ready to lose the life I had, even if it was already crumbling in ways I refused to admit. But things escalated again. One evening I had tried to keep my distance, making excuses not to be alone with Gary. I stayed home more, claiming headaches or saying I was too tired to visit. Matt was so caught up in his own world, he didn't question it. But then Gary came by the house again. When Matt was working late, I should have expected it, should have known better, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. That evening I had been folding laundry in the living room, mindlessly watching some show on TV, trying to lose myself in anything other than my thoughts, when I heard a knock at the door. My stomach twisted in knots. I already knew who it was before I even got up to check. My heart raced as I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door like it was the entrance to some trap. I knew I couldn't escape, but I couldn't just ignore it, not when he knew I was home. I opened the door to find Gary standing there, wearing that same casual smile, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans, like he was just there to chat, just a friendly visit from the father-in-law. I wanted to shut the door in his face, to tell him to leave, but instead I stood there, my voice stuck in my throat. "Evening, darling," he said, his tone way too familiar, too soft. I thought I'd stop by, see how you're doing. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, brushing past me with that same casual ease he always carried. I could smell the faint hint of alcohol on him, but not enough to think he was drunk. Maybe that was worse. At least if he'd been drunk, I could chalk it up to bad decisions, to something other than what it really was, his desire to assert power over me. "I'm fine, Gary," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady as I backed away toward the living room. "Mac not home?" "So maybe you should." "I know Mac not home," he interrupted, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no warmth in them now, just a dark intensity that made my skin crawl. He stepped closer, closing the space between us faster than I could move away. I should have run, should have screamed, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could reason with him, or maybe I was just too scared of what would happen if I fought back. All I knew was that the room felt smaller, the air thicker, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears as he backed me into the corner of the couch. "You didn't say anything to Matt, did you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper now. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and I flinched. "That's good. You don't want to hurt him, do you?" I shook my head, my heart racing. "Please, Gary, you need to go," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. But he didn't leave. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my skin, his hand sliding down my arm, gripping my wrist tightly. "I can help you, you know," he said, his voice low and sickeningly sweet. "You and Matt aren't having any luck, are you? You need a real man to take care of things, don't you?" I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, and he pushed me back against the couch, his weight pressing me down. I could barely breathe, the panic rising in my chest like a Tidal wave please I begged, but my voice was weak, barely audible, and then it happened again. This time it was worse. This time I fought back. I scratched at his arms, kicked at him, but he was stronger than me, and he knew it. He didn't care about the scratches, about my weak attempts to get him off me. He just kept going, his hand clamped over my mouth, so I couldn't scream. It didn't last long, but it felt like an eternity when it was over. He stood up, brushing off his jeans like nothing had happened, like this was just another ordinary moment. I was left on the couch, trembling, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't even cry. I was too shocked, too numb. You'll keep this between us, won't you? He said, standing over me, his voice cold and hard. Now you don't want to ruin Matt's life, do you? I didn't say anything. I just nodded, too terrified to do anything else. He gave me one last look before walking out, leaving me there broken and alone. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat on the bathroom floor, the same spot I'd sat in after the first time, my knees pulled to my chest, my body aching. I didn't bother scrubbing my skin this time. What was the point? I wasn't ever going to be clean again, not after this. The days that followed were a blur of numbness. I moved through my life like a ghost, going through the motions, but feeling nothing. Matt didn't notice. He was too busy with work, too tired to see the distance growing between us. I wanted to tell him, but every time I thought about it, I saw Gary's face, heard his voice in my head reminding me of what it would do to Matt if he found out. I couldn't break him, I couldn't break us, so I stayed silent. And then a few weeks later I realized I was late. When I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't relieved or happy the way I thought I'd be in that moment, standing in the cramped bathroom with a positive test in my trembling hand. I felt something far more terry, in a hollow sense of dread, the kind that settles deep in your bones and refuses to leave. I should have been celebrating, should have been overjoyed at the thought of finally giving Matt the family we longed for, but I couldn't not. With the knowledge that this child, the child I was carrying, wasn't his, it was Gary's. The first few months of my pregnancy were a blur of silence and guilt. I forced myself to smile when Matt hugged me, his excitement bubbling over as he began making plans, talking about the future, about the nursery, about names. But all I could feel was a gnawing weight inside me, growing heavier with each passing day, just like the life inside me. Each time Matt touched my stomach, I wanted to pull away. I wanted to scream, but I stayed silent, my lips sealed with a secret I'd sworn to never tell. The worst part was Gary. He knew, of course. I could feel it in the way he looked at me. Every time we were in the same room, his gaze lingered a little too long on my swelling belly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, like he was proud of himself, like he had won. He never said a word, but that look was enough to make my skin crawl. I hated him, but more than that I hated myself, hated that I hadn't fought harder, hadn't run when I had the chance. Now there was no running from this. It was inside me, growing, a constant reminder of the dark, twisted secret carried. Matt's parents were over the moon when we told them the news. His mother cried tears of joy, wrapping me in a tight hug, telling me how proud she was, how this was what the family needed. Gary stood behind her, his face a mask of calm satisfaction. It made me sick to my stomach. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before the nausea overtook me. I was supposed to be happy, wasn't I? This was supposed to be the dream. But it had become my nightmare. The pregnancy was hard, both physically and emotionally. I felt exhausted all the time, worn down by the weight of what I was carrying, not just the baby, but the unbearable guilt. Matt tried to be supportive, but as the months passed, I could see him retreating more and more into his work. He was absent in ways he hadn't been before. Even though he was physically there, it was like a wall had gone up between us, and I didn't know how to tear it down without it shattering everything. How could I reach him when I was the one holding the hammer, ready to destroy it all? When our daughter was born, I should have felt relief, or maybe joy, but instead, as I held her for the first time, I felt only an overwhelming sadness. She was beautiful, perfect in every way, tiny fingers, soft skin, a little TFT of dark hair. But all I could see was Gary. All I could feel was the weight of what she represented. She wasn't just a child, she was the living embodiment of everything I tried to bury, every horrible moment I'd kept locked away inside, and now she was here in my arms. And there was no escaping her. The family was ecstatic, of course. They fawned over her, especially Gary. He was always around, offering to help, holding her every chance he got. It made my skin crawl. But what could I do? He was her grandfather, and to everyone else, he was just a doting family man. They didn't know what I knew. They couldn't see the darkness behind his smile, the way his hands lingered on her just a little too long, the way he looked at me over her tiny head, his eyes filled with something cold and possessive. I hated him. I hated that he had this power over me, over us. After she was born, things between Matt and me only got worse. At first, he was excited, throwing himself into fatherhood the way I had hoped he would, but as time went on, we drifted further apart. We barely spoke anymore, and when we did, it was strained, like we were two strangers living in the same house. He didn't ask why I was so distant, didn't press me when I pulled away from his touch. He was too busy with the baby, too busy working late nights trying to support us. But I knew the truth. He was avoiding me as much as I was avoiding him. The unspoken distance grew thickened until it was like an impenetrable wall between us. I couldn't look at my daughter without feeling the sharp sting of guilt. She was innocent, but every time I held her I was reminded of Gary, of what he did, of how I had failed to protect myself, and now I couldn't protect her from the truth. I wanted to love her the way a mother is supposed to love her child, but every time I looked into her bright, curious eyes, all I saw was the secret I could never tell. It was eating me alive. I started to wonder if I should tell Matt the truth. Every night I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the words in my head. Picture how I'd say it, how I'd explain everything, but every time the thought of the destruction it would cause stopped me cold. Telling him would tear everything apart. It would ruin him, ruin us. And what would happen to our daughter? How would Matt ever look at her the same way? If he knew, how would he look at me? But keeping the secret was its own kind of hell. The weight of it was unbearable, suffocating. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I was alone with my thoughts, they spiraled into dark, hopeless places. I felt trapped, like I was drowning in a sea of guilt and shame, and no one could save me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to live with this secret, but I didn't know how to destroy my family by revealing it either. Every day I lived with the fear that it would all come crashing down, that somehow Matt would find out, that Gary would slip up, or I'd lose control and blurt out the truth in a moment of weakness. The worst part was the guilt that I was a bad mother, a bad wife, a bad person, the guilt that I couldn't love my daughter the way she deserved to be loved, the guilt that I had let this happen in the first place. I couldn't live with it, but I couldn't live without it either. It was part of me now, woven into the fabric of who I was. I wanted to be free. I wanted to tell someone, to confess everything, and finally let go of the secret that was poisoning me, but I couldn't. The fear of what would happen if I did was too strong, too overwhelming, so I stayed silent, trapped in my own prison, unsure if I'd ever find a way out.